Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Carrie Burke, your moderator for today's webinar, Reducing Attack Surface in Budget-Constrained Environments. You may send in questions at any time during the presentation via the Q&A chat feature. We will collect these and address them at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce John Dixon. John is an internationally recognized security leader, entrepreneur, and principal at Denim Group. He has nearly 20 years hands-on experience in intrusion detection, network and application security in the commercial, public, and military sectors. As a Denim Group principal, he helps executives and chief security officers of Fortune 500 companies and government organizations launch and expand their critical application security initiatives.
Hey, thanks, Carrie. Thanks, everybody, for taking time out of a busy World Cup watching season to focus on what our first love, which is security and the fun of protecting our organizations in spite of the fact that we're all resource constrained. And let me just give you a little bit of background. This presentation is a variation of one I did for a state government organization in a not too distant recent past who almost all of the participants in the audience complained about budget. We don't have budget, we can't do this, we understand all these different things. And then I came to realize it may be acute in the public sector, but is simply no different in our organizations, in the commercial world, in the private sector also. We're always going to have more things to fix than we have budget. We're always going to have more vulnerabilities that we're able to identify and remediate. We're always going to have threats that are probably more expansive than our ability to defend. So really, if you want to boil down this session, it's going to be how do you do more with less, you know, bang for the buck, whatever cliche you want to use. So I am going to basically wrap up towards the end, but I want to have questions and answers throughout. So we have this chat feature that works. Please send questions, and I will address them either at the end or if I can do it in stride. So let's get going. And first of all, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear. I just saw that we had a participant that might not be able to hear. If you could text me or to message me privately, let me know if you can't hear, that would be great. So many of y'all know me. I recognize a bunch of names on the call, but I'm a security professional who've been in the business for now over 20 years. Kind of cut my teeth in the 90s as in the Air Force Information Warfare Center as a analyst in the Air Force CERT, or Computer Emergency Response Team. Now I spend almost entirely most of my time focusing on helping application security efforts, helping people push them within organizations, helping CISOs get sponsorship for and budget for major application security initiatives. And so that's where I focus most of my activity. This is much of what we talk about today will include application security, but it's a little bit broader than that, so bear with me as we get into that. Many of you know us, but for those that don't, Denim Group is an application security focused company that does a variety of things, but mostly I guess we try to keep our clients out of the news by helping them find their vulnerabilities, mostly on the application side, mostly before they get out in production environments. So we help keep our guys out of the news, and we do that by proactively finding the problems before they show up. And for those that don't know, we have a product named ThreatFix. It represents a big chunk of our efforts right now. And what that does is it accelerates the remediation of application vulnerabilities. So without being too much autobiographical, I'll jump into things. A lot of you are going to have a teary eye when you see this picture of the conventional network. For those who've been around since the 90s, the old, the outside internet connected through a firewall to our local area network. And this brought a bunch of different metaphors that, including circling the wagon train, the castle and moat metaphors from the early 90s and such, when, the organizations were pretty well defined and you had, an interior network and an exterior network and maybe an entry point or two. Those days are gone, and I think this particular diagram does no justice to the changing nature of the network environment. I mean, you throw in remote workers, you throw in web, mobile, You throw in, cloud-hosted things, cloud development. Essentially, understanding the attack surface ends up becoming more of an imperative because that is ephemeral, it changes, it's ever-changing, and it's no longer as easy as just running a handful of scanners. So we'll talk about what that means for you and how to, essentially leverage your resources. So the way I look at the world, there's two sets of organizations. One is the targeted organizations, the very large banks, the military, the place where money exists, because they're always going to be targeted. The Wells Fargos of the world, the Bank of Americas, the Citigroups, they're always going to be targeted because that's where money is. For different purposes, many of our government agencies and our military agencies are going to be targeted as well for different purposes. But the key is the rest of the world, the smaller companies, the medium-sized banks, the regional insurance companies are really in the other area, which is the targets of opportunity. These are the places where they're not as big, they maybe don't have as big a security team, but certainly they have the risk for them is just as big. But they don't show up on the radar screen of many attackers unless they do something that makes them show up. If they click on a link or they get caught in some type of phishing campaign. So the challenge is for those small organizations that are not the levels of the American Expresses and Banks of America, how do you reasonably do the right set of things to keep under the radar screen and without spinning your way into oblivion? And much of that, of what I'm going to talk about, has that as essentially an ethos. So the other thing is we're in a breathtaking environment from the standpoint of the threat and how it's evolved and become much more sophisticated, much more automated, much more use of essentially items that the attackers buy. They can just buy wholesale in the underground market. Instead of building and crafting a custom exploit for a big bank or a big financial services thing, they essentially cobble together a set of software and services and attackware and call centers and mules and stolen accounts, compromised hosts, and they essentially cobble together an attack based upon things that they can buy in the wholesale underground market. So that's changed a lot, and what 20 years ago ended up being something that you would have to spend a lot of time and energy and maybe craft a custom exploit to accomplish can be done now via essentially leasing or licensing that capability. It's hard to believe, but it's gotten so much so that you can cobble together those capabilities, and that means that the threshold for creating a sophisticated attack is simply much slower. And so that means that you don't have to be the uber hacker that writes his own exploits. You can essentially put these things together and go after not the biggest banks, but even smaller organizations. Couple that with the ransomware and malware that also is available in the underground market. Many of these pieces of software are purely automated. They may not have intelligence behind them, and they may not go after particularly targeted threats. But if you are going to look at from the threat side and just dismiss the fact that you could get targeted, then you can always bring up the ransomware issue around saying, look, we don't have to be targeted. We just get found, and that's the good and bad thing about ransomware. So the starting point, I would say, and I'll talk a little bit about security budgets. Obviously, one of the strengths of a security leader and a CISO is to get as much, marshal as much resources and to make the business argument to get as much capabilities so that they can adequately protect the organization. And obviously that's dependent on industries, that's dependent on corporate culture, on risk appetite, all these different functions. But my observation has been, talking to CISOs and security leaders throughout the U.S. is that some simply have already lost the battle before they've engaged. They're already lost the game before they're on the field, whatever. And part of it is that you can tell as a consultant, you get to look at many different environments. And we've seen very similar sized organizations that have the same risk profile. They're in the same industry, yet one of them is very sophisticated, has a great team, and takes security seriously, and another one essentially is barely doing compliance-based stuff. Same industry, same background. So you don't want to be the CISO in that organization that doesn't get it. And but realizing that in this environment, you're competing against all these other business imperatives, against CEO pet projects, you're inheriting a legacy environment, and not just legacy apps in the traditional sense. Unless you start at the ground floor of a company and it's a greenfield operation, I mean, you're going to inherit Apache program, you're going to inherit identity management, all these, you're going to inherit the policies that maybe a set of predecessors put together. And you got to keep the trains running. You got to keep the lights on. So that's going to take a big set of your, a big chunk of your time and resources is just be keeping things going. Obviously, the current event side then changes everything. And as a security role and CIO role is very operational. I mean, you have, and I don't have to state the obvious. You come in on a Monday expecting to do all these different things, and then a circuit goes out, or a data center has some interruption, and your week is shot. That is a reality. We get that. And so the other problem that we have is one that the CISO of Wells Fargo, Rich Bache, captured very eloquently, and he basically said that essentially what we do is a silent service. What we do is taken for granted until there is a problem. And so you have to keep that in mind. So we'll keep going here on this theme. So I did a presentation at RSA in 2014 on how to get your security budget approved without any FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt. And if you're interested in that, we can send you the URL, but you can also Google it, and I think that shows up. But basically, there's some non-intuitive strategies that we've seen over and over that get executed within the enterprise by savvy and sophisticated CISOs. They do things like exploit pet projects. They find out what the CEO's projects is. Maybe there's an M&A effort that's going on that they can leverage to get some security spend in. The classic one that I've heard in the public sector is that the CISOs will be scrutinized for operational O&M budgets, annual budgets, but yet if they have security spend that gets baked into a bond project or a CapEx project, there's less scrutiny because the dollars are bigger and it's a different funding source. We things like a culture and how organizations spend money, all those are taken into account. The one or two other things I just want to emphasize before I move on is the most successful CISOs that we've seen, they are able to cultivate relationships throughout the organization. Nobody tells them who they are, but the key leaders, probably that have either budget or budget influence, and they do so without asking for anything. They basically become informal risk advisors. And what they do then, though, is they wait to capitalize on an outside event. Think of an Equifax breach or some very public breach. So they built up this credibility. They built up this kind of wealth of goodwill. And it's at that time that they then go in and say, wait a second, yeah, you saw this, you wanted my opinion. I know we've been talking about this for the last year and a half, but yeah, this is a risk. I put together some basic numbers of what I think we need to do now that the landscape has changed. The point is here that savvy and sophisticated security leaders really know how to play that side of the house. They know how to cultivate and get informal budget buy-in, and then they use the external events to capitalize on it. So anyhow, so let's get into the attack surface part itself. And again, the landscape part is important. The background and the culture, all that stuff is important. But let's talk about a security officer's journey. And I'm going to really focus on an AppSec example. But we talk about two different axes, the insight and perception, and about different security risk, in this case around web applications and other applications. So the perceptions when you talk about about application security is, it's always going to be about web apps. But those who have been in the business for some time know that that's a naive approach, because obviously there's going to be maybe some legacy client-server apps and maybe some desktop apps. And in case you don't worry about that anymore, now that there's ransomware, it becomes maybe a little bit more important than it used to be. And now with everyone shifting to the cloud, cloud-based applications, throw in web services if you wanted to, mobile applications, and the such. So like the challenge is, the perception and what we see in the field is, web applications have some level of coverage, but maybe not what they should be. So we see more visibility and scanning. And our philosophy is you want to get absolutely everything under automated scanning as much as you can, but recognize where scanning doesn't get you in the end zone and supplement that with some smart human beings, either on the inside or outside or both. So again, web applications are kind of viewed as the main threat vector, which they might very well be. But over time, you end up with a progression of essentially a scaling up of scanning and a scaling up of recurring visibility. And if you want to apply a maturity curve to this, it's absolutely the case. But the recognition is the fact that your attack surface is not the web application alone. It's all these other places. And again, this is just one aspect, a microcosm of the bigger problem, which is the diffusion of attack surface, in this case, web and other applications. So what I'd say here is our philosophy is get everything under automated scanning, scan as much as you possibly can in a non-intrusive way, build scanning into the CI/CD pipeline if you're doing DevOps like application development, and recognize where the automation needs some level of mindfulness to augment that. So let's talk about some suggested strategies. And again, these are all tailored to your environment. Some of these may be relevant, some of these will be less relevant. But having a fundamental and distinct understanding of where your most sensitive client data lives. If you're a PCI-driven retail company, you're probably going to know where your customer data is. You're going to know where it is and it isn't, because you've had to manage audits, PCI QSA audits. But essentially, that is the starting point. You want to tailor your rigorous testing based upon what you perceive and what you've socialized as the threat. Is it Eastern European, organized crime? Is it anonymous? Essentially, you need to agree upon, communicate, and socialize the level of rigor for testing. And, maybe if you're in a certain industry where you don't perceive to be a threat, mining or maybe a industrial firm where you're not worried about IP, you can get by with, a once-a-year scan. Maybe you don't have a lot of mobile or application attack surface out there. Maybe you don't need to do any application security scanning. But if you have a big e-commerce presence, you do a lot of transactions, there's a lot of money involved, that changes things, incredibly quick, fast. Don't forget about the off-prem stuff, the mobile, cloud, social media. We've had multiple clients who have had, breach or near breach situations, and they always forget the off-premise properties around social media, around, let's say they have a dev box for cloud that's hosted at Rackspace or something like that. Those don't maybe not show up on an automated scan of your environment, because part of the challenge that we have to do is we have to limit, when we do network scanning, for example, we have to define the scope, and we don't want to interrupt day-to-day production. So there's always stuff that's out of scope. But when you are doing this type of activity, you don't have any limitations. You want to make sure you have everything under scope. And then regularly conduct pen tests based upon that threat. Or do automated scanning all the time, and then once a year, twice a year, do sophisticated pen testing with a social engineering component to it. Same thing on the network side, eliminate the most obvious stuff, I would say. It's less about operational excellence. It's more about eliminating the most obvious threats. And if you've read the Verizon data breach investigation report, you will see there are still some of the garden variety old school attacks and old school vulnerabilities that exist. So, I mean, you really have to make sure you've got the old stuff done and covered. You can't throw away your AV. You can't do, ignore basic blocking and tackling, because as part of any reconnaissance effort, the attackers are going to look at that stuff too, not just the APT-like threats or the crazy stuff. I also recommend conducting quarterly phishing campaigns or even more frequently. What that does is that exposes the attack surface via the weakest link, the humans, and also given the ransomware and attacks and given other stuff within the enterprise that test the internal security, I always recommend to keep DNS registry close at heart, because many of the attacks that we've seen involve attempts to redirect DNS or to do that. And then always have a social engineering exercise with firm leadership. I think every sophisticated attack we've seen in the last 6 months involves some aspect of social engineering, and so coupling a technical test with that is a good use. Doing tabletops with execs to show them how social engineering is prevalent is very positive, and part of the reason is because the execs themselves can be targeted. So this is becoming less an IT and security issue, more a corporate security issue, but it is happening en masse across the organizations. Obviously, you want to look at DLP because you want to see stuff that's exiting the organization. Little things like, don't forget some of the cool things in AD that you can do to have a stronger starting point. I don't want to ignore that. And logging, I mean, nobody does logging as well as they would like to do. So stuff like that, I think, are great ideas that we've seen in a compilation of ones in the field. We use, for example, a secure FTP capability to send and receive sensitive client docs for example, penetration tests. Stuff you don't want to be sending out over email, but there's an example of, if you really want to take it to the extreme attack surface around email, people sending sensitive reports out via those type of services. We recommend, to really look at protecting information in transit and it's at rest using things like MDM in the mobile enterprises, looking at the MDMs and how they're set up and how you've implemented your bring your own device approach. Fully, roll out disk encryption for all laptops. I told a story recently about a client who had not implemented disk encryption and had lost a couple of laptops. And it was a major corporate event that got visibility all the way to the CEO level. They implemented full disk encryption on the Windows laptops, and then they had lost 2 or 3 laptops like 6 months later. Didn't even register on the radar screen because it was not an issue anymore, the way that they had implemented essentially full disk encryption. So that's the good news, is if you do those type of things, not only are you doing the right thing for limiting your attack surface and limiting the security, you're also essentially getting way upstream and preventing huge crises around entirely preventable areas. We also suggest upgrading to the next-gen antivirus malware detection and endpoint detection, given that the outside protections are, no longer, the sole source of protection for the organization. 2FA, two-factor authentication, at least for admins and at least for execs. I don't know why this hasn't been ubiquitous, and I mean, it could be the simple stuff too. It doesn't have to be the tokens and go the full-blown way of doing that. It can be real easy. We see implementation of a lot of email security techniques that have helped out a lot, including using encrypted email throughout. So these are just basic blocking and tackling things. But again, I would argue if you're a security leader and you essentially show up midstream, understanding the full breadth of attack surface is step number one. So that includes either looking at, validating your patching program, look at third-party risk of, content management, oh my gosh, all the different plugins and issues that we've seen with CMSs and ends up being a big kind of heartache. And essentially what you're trying to do is maybe not be operationally perfect or excellent. You're really trying to make sure that you are avoiding the craziest challenges like having SQL injections on your public website. So it's a philosophical approach, but it is nonetheless something that we feel strongly about. Another thing is part of that attack surface thing is understanding essentially when bad things are going bad. So understanding the base tempo of the organization, I would argue, is related to this discussion because you need to know when, not if, but when things go wrong, when people are trying to get in and when they're successful in getting in. And so I would say as somebody that's done incident response in the past that you want every bit of data as soon as something happens, and you want it to be trusted. So that's the first question we ask is, what do you have? What do you trust? Is it encrypted? Did you, if it's trusted logging, do you have logs that are hashed and can't be edited or reversed? All that stuff is stuff you can rely on, but it helps in the bad time. And then my last recommendation is I think that partnering with either MSSPs or vendors, having a vendor organization from the outside help is positive for one reason. Guys like us see a lot of different strategies implemented. They see a lot what works and what doesn't in certain organizations, and you want to leverage that. And the other reason is if you do have something go wrong, you want to be able to reach out to them and they'll have some context. They'll have some ability to potentially augment your team. The reason I say this is because if you do have an incident and you don't have those relationships, you don't have a vendor or an outside group to rely on, when stuff hits the fan, you start calling. You just open up the yellow book and call people. We regularly turn down those type of requests because, candidly, we don't have an existing relationship. They haven't been a client, and suddenly we're being asked to airdrop in the middle of a firefight, and who knows how bad it is. So we, from a risk management standpoint, have avoided those type of projects and will continue. So that means that if you want to have access to people, you probably need to either reach out, have some option to do that, or have some pre-existing relationship, which infers that they're doing something for you. So with that, a couple of points before we wind down and leave time for questions and answers. Why is this important? Because I think we're always going to have more risk, threats, technical debt than we're going to have budget. Always going to be the case. I think the threats are evolving and adapting and becoming more sophisticated, and I am constantly amazed by what I'm seeing. So that's the other thing, is the whole threat landscape is shifting. And then finally couple that with the fact that your own attack surface is in flux, particularly as it relates to the cloud, to the mobile workers, to applications in general. And so the fact that you've got a constrained budget, you've got threats that are evolving, and you've got an attack surface that is evolving pretty quickly, I think that this is something that you've got to be acutely aware of. And I would say from a CISO standpoint, for the first 100 days, understanding what's hanging out there has to be the first issue item. And with that, I wrapped up really about 30 minutes into it, so we have some time for questions and answers. Let me read this one. Aside from training, are there systems or tools that can help protect against ransomware? Let me just say broadly, yes. I mean, that's where the next generation antivirus endpoint security is going to help a big chunk. You know, the stuff that is implemented, the products that have implemented some type of non-signature based identification are probably the best because these tools are, the attack tools are morphing so quickly. But ultimately, the number one protection is, you know, having a well thought through and rigorous patching program. And candidly, most of the ransomware is written to attack, you know, Windows hosts and servers. So, I mean, granted, there's going to be a lot of cats and dogs out there in hardware and Linux products and, and others that are going to be patched, but we always recommend to start with the Windows host and the Windows servers because, you know, many of the ransomware writers and malware writers are going to go after the real big Microsoft stuff because that's where the risks are. So anyhow, that's our thought. How can you expand on how would somebody might leverage an existing project to include security funding? Okay, what I would say there is if it's an existing project, that's a little bit of a tough curveball. I mean, what I would say is what you want to do as a security leader is negotiate at the front of a project. If you are in the middle of a project and you find, you realize you have a feeling that we need to do some security looking, that's the business case to bring somebody in or to do it yourself, but to do an assessment or technical test, pen test, whatever you want to do. Part of the reason is you could say, well, like, we're midway through this. We had thought about doing security testing, but we didn't, you know, specifically fund it, and now we've done a random scan, and we found all this stuff. We need to add this to the budget. So where I've seen that in the past is either through design or by default, organizations will do scanning at some pre-production point and then find vulnerabilities and then you know, attach funding to remediate them. That's less than optimal, but I mean, if you've already started, I don't think if you have any, I think you have less options. So I think that's the last question that I have. We've got a particularly shy group today, but I would say that's my Twitter handle. If you follow me, I'll follow you back, and then you can DM me questions afterwards. And again, I recognize a few of y'all out there. Again, appreciate the time that we've had. I look forward to meeting you in the real world, and I look forward to you know, talking to you when I do. But thanks so much. Again, at John B. Dixon on Twitter, john@denimgroup.com on email. And, you know, have a wonderful week.